Hi, my name is Kristen Bramer Moore, and I'm a partner at Tonkon Torp LLP and the chair of our Labor and Employment Practice Group. In this unprecedented time of pandemic, and as our community prepares to reopen and get back to work, we want you to know that we are here for you. Our labor and employment attorneys are staying updated on legal developments and are ready to provide you with counsel as needed by offering advice, giving online presentations, and by sharing written materials and other resources to help you and your business. Do not hesitate to reach out if our legal experts can assist you or your company in any way. Click the link below to be connected to a Tonkon Torp attorney. Take care.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Clay Creps. I'm a partner in the Labor and Employment Group at Tonkon Torp, and I am one of today's panelists. My colleague, Megan Reuther, another attorney at Tonkon Torp in the Labor and Employment Group, is the other panelist today. Welcome to our webinar, is Telecommuting the New Normal. Our hope is to provide you with practical advice for your business to thrive during this pandemic. If you have questions unique to your business, we invite you to reach out to me or Megan directly, or the Tonkon Torp lawyer you normally work with to discuss your specific situation. Let me pause and make a note about this format. First, please know we are recording this webinar. You do not need to sign a disclosure and no private information of yours will be shared. Please know, however, that should you choose to participate in our Q&A section, your questions may be recorded in association with your name. Feel free to submit questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom app. We will do our best to answer some of the questions as they come up. However, we want to be sure to have time for the presentation, so if we don't answer your question right away, please wait for the end. Because the situation is so rapidly changing, we may actually not know the answer, or your question may be too nuanced or specific for us to address in this webinar format. In that event, we welcome you to reach out to one of us or, again, the Tonkon Torp attorney you usually work with. We will conclude with a Q&A session and we'll try to hit as many of the questions as we can. We welcome any feedback you may have after this webinar. If there are other topics you want to hear about, tell us. We hope to be a source of information for our business community throughout this challenging time and plan to hold additional webinars going forward. Finally, information presented here is current as of May 28, 2020, and it is not intended to be legal advice. So let's get started. Megan, will you lead us off?
Thanks, Clay. So I think we can all agree that there's been two predominant trends regarding the workplace that have developed since the COVID crisis. First, many people are out of work, and also many people are working from home. Prior to the crisis, many employers were skeptical that work could be performed remotely. The experience with the crisis has been the opposite. Work is getting done with varying degrees of success and productivity. Given that work from home appears to be the reality, at least for the foreseeable future, and that this experience has begun a conversation about whether work from home might be the new normal, and whether many employers need to continue to examine the legal and practical implications of working from home. COVID has rapidly changed our workplaces. Many employers are currently telecommuting that otherwise would not be. Some even estimate that more than half of US workers are currently working from home. This is a substantial increase from the fraction that was working from home last year. While the pandemic appears to have accelerated the trend toward teleworking, perhaps permanently. While we're still uncertain how long the pandemic will last, employees are more and more reporting a preference to work from home. Polls from the beginning of April show that a majority of American adults will prefer to work from home even after the crisis ends. Employers should expect a rise in requests to telecommute even after. And employees and employers are finding creative ways to complete their work responsibilities remotely, finding that a significant amount of work can be done remotely. As a result, many companies are extending telecommuting through September or even later. Other companies that you might have read about, like Twitter or Facebook, are indicating that they're going to make these changes permanent, at least for a portion of their workforce. Telecommuting appears to be our new normal. Of course, some jobs can't be done remotely, and we understand that. And except for cases where employees are working from home because of a reasonable accommodation, It remains the employer's option whether employees have the opportunity to work from home after this pandemic ends. Maybe you've already done this, but in order to evaluate whether working from home is going to work for your company, you should weigh several considerations. Obviously, you're going to need to know whether the work can even be done remotely. Like I said, some can't be. Does the company have an existing infrastructure that will allow it to support remote work? And if it doesn't, is that something the company can put together? Is there resources available to expend to create that infrastructure? We need to evaluate whether the work requires a certain amount of collaboration that can't be done virtually, whether there's going to be an impact on the efficiency and productivity, and if there's any way to mitigate that, and whether there's an impact on the company's culture, the sense of community, and again, whether resources such as Zoom or other resources can be used to mitigate the effect on the culture. All these things should be weighed in this decision.
Let's look at some of the pros and cons of working from home, because there's been a lot written recently about this, and it's very interesting. One of the pros of working from home is that there is vastly increased flexibility to take care of life stuff, appointments and errands that when you're going into the office, you're simply not able to attend to. Many employees find that one of the pros is that they no longer have a commute. They're not spending that half hour, hour or more each way each day. So they're saving time, but they're also saving money. It appears that one of the pros is that employees may be more productive working from home. The jury's still out on that, however. Employees find fewer interruptions from meetings and just chit chat. Employees have the ability to create their own work environment and can make it very comfortable for themselves. Stress levels seem to be reducing because of no commute and no stressful work environment. Interestingly, studies show that people tend to exercise more when they work from home. They have more time with family, and there are some potential tax advantages if you have a dedicated workspace at home for your work. There are, however, some negatives to working at home. There is that loss of at-work collaboration, sitting down and meeting with someone. Employees report feeling social and professional isolation. They feel out of the loop. Interestingly, historically, promotion rates for employees who work from home tend to be lower, and that may be as a result of the isolation and lack of collaboration. One of the biggest negatives that's being reported about working from home is that there is no separation between work and leisure or home time. People are forgetting to clock out. It's hard to switch off. Just this week on Tuesday, Bloomberg published an article highlighting this issue. It quoted a study saying that US workers are logging 3 more hours per day on the job than before this crisis hit us. Moreover, during that time when workers were typically disconnected from the office, evenings and overnight, there has been an increase in work, with VPN providers noting a large spike in usage from midnight to 3 a.m. The article reports that this is leading to workers expressing a desire to get back to the office to work to provide them with more structure and a break from work. So we have this tension, many workers saying, yeah, I want to stay home. Others saying, no, I want to get back to the office. One of the things that has been true before, but is now even more true because we're relying more on electronic communication, is the potential to misread cues in electronic communication, a loss of clarity with that communication. Another thing is an employee has to make an effort to get a change of scenery. There's distraction, a loss of motivation, and there can be technological problems with connecting to the workplace and that sort of thing. Megan?
So you've decided that you're going to allow telecommuting. What do you need to do next? What do you need to do to get your business ready? One of the first steps that we recommend taking is putting together a robust telecommuting policy. The overarching goal of this policy should be to set a clear expectation for employees and create open channels of communication. Obviously, the policy will be needed to be tailored to fit your business, but for the next couple of minutes, Clay and I are going to go over some of the common aspects of telecommuting policies. For one, you'll want the policy to clearly state that telecommuting is not an entitlement. As the employer, you have full and complete discretion whether to permit work from home or not. However, keep in mind the caveat that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. If telecommuting arrangement stems from a request for reasonable accommodation, the situation is going to be a little bit different. We're not going to discuss that today, but if you ever have questions, we're always happy to answer them. For the general telecommuting policy, if you're permitting work from home because of COVID, you want to state that explicitly in your policy, as well as state that that entitlement may, or that allowance may end after the crisis is passed. The key here is that employees understand that the arrangement is short-term and they have no entitlement to continue working from home after the pandemic ends. You may also want your policy to lay out the procedure through which an employee can request to work from home. Who do they need to ask? Are there forms that they need to fill out? And what's the process going to be like? Your policy should answer those questions. Also, what criteria are you going to consider when deciding whether to allow a telecommuting arrangement? This may include requirements that employees have worked for you for at least 1 year or have completed their introductory or probationary periods. It also could require them not to be on a work improvement plan. Whatever it is, lay that out in your policy. And remember, whatever criteria you apply, make sure you're treating employees as equally as possible. In other words, as Clay's going to talk about in a few minutes, anti-discrimination and anti-retaliation laws still apply. Your telecommuting policy may also want to remind employees that all of your other policies still apply equally as well. All employees must comply with the organizational rules, policies, and procedures regardless of where they work. Hours of work is also an important aspect, so you may want to include in your telecommuting policy. How many hours a day are employees expected to work? Are there specific hours, like between 8 and 5, or can they tailor their schedule to their needs, maybe family needs or childcare needs? Do they have flexibility? Remember your non-exempt employees here. This is really important. You'll need to lay out exactly how these employees are expected to report their hours, as well as the overtime guidelines. Employers can use a number of tools here for maintaining appropriate timekeeping for non-exempt employees if they're working remotely. It could be an electronic timesheet, documenting hours via some sort of spreadsheet, or asking employees to email their managers when they clock in and out. Whatever you use, managers are going to need to be diligent about reminding employees to follow those timekeeping policies. Employees, you should also make sure that you're monitoring the hours reported to make sure that employees are reporting and that they're reporting it accurately. Along the same lines, part of complying with these wage and hour obligations that unfortunately do not go away is making sure your employees and supervisors understand what qualifies for work. For example, but I was just responding to a text message excuse is something we hear a lot. Working from home may mean that non-exempt employees have access to their email, their work phones, or other technologies at all times, even on weekends. They need to understand they should not be engaging in work activities after the end of their workday. That is, they're not to call or respond to text messages or respond to an email, and if they do, they need to be writing down that time. This needs to be strictly enforced. Employees need to be paid for all hours that they work, even if it's just responding to a text message at 11 o'clock at night. And if they don't follow these policies, you may need to follow your regular discipline procedure. Again, these wage and hour issues are ways that we see employers get into trouble with telecommuting. They can be avoided with a strong policy that lays out the expectations, that trains managers and supervisors with diligent oversight and routine enforcement. Another topic we recommend including in your policy is how employees are to treat and safeguard your confidential information. Working outside the office may mean that trade secrets and sensitive business information have also traveled outside your office. You should make sure that employees are aware of company policies on confidential information and information security, and in particular are aware about how these policies play out in a remote work setting. For example, Or for instance, making clear to employees what physical items are acceptable to be taken from the workplace and what aren't. How they should treat that confidential information, such as keeping them out of public spaces and making sure their passwords are up to date. Separate from the policies, you may want to consider training employees and managers to take internet security safely. This can include spotting suspicious emails and, again, the importance of a strong password. Finally, the policy should inform employees under no uncertain terms that if there is a concern of a breach, that needs to be immediately reported.
Following up further on policies that you're going to want to have, that would be requirements regarding the workspace. You should have a policy which addresses Osha complaints. Regardless of where the workspace is, OSHA places a mandate on employers to provide a safe workplace. The policy should have provisions which require employees to keep their workspaces safe and free from hazards. Now, for example, I don't know about you, but I'm thinking my workspace from home might not pass OSHA muster. I'm at the dining room table with cables and wires running everywhere. It's a real tripping hazard. So what should the policy provide? Should employers inspect the workplace at home? Should they simply rely on reminding employees to keep their workspaces safe? Guidance that OSHA issued way back in 1999 indicates that there is a responsibility on employers. The key is to avoid exposure to reasonably foreseeable hazards. The big thing seems to be identifying potential hazards and notifying employees of those and training them regarding these if necessary. Further, OSHA has clearly said it will not be inspecting home workplaces, and just as clearly, OSHA has said that it does not expect employers to inspect home workplaces. So the key is to have a robust policy advising employees to keep their home workspaces safe and identifying reasonably foreseeable risks, such as tripping over computer cords or wires, or other risks that might be attendant to the specific kind of work the employee is doing from home. The policy should address home office insurance and liability issues. It should require an employee to have insurance against injuries in the home workspace. You might want to have your policy address tax issues. As noted above, there can be some tax advantages to working from home. The policy, however, should state clearly that accessing those benefits is the responsibility of the employee, and the company is not going to assist with any advice related to those tax issues. You want to stay away from that. The policy should address dependent care issues. Restrictions on providing dependent care while telecommuting can be included in the telecommuting policy. Now, ideally, the policy should provide that dependent care should have no greater impact on the employee's work than if the employee were working from the office. Obviously, while we're in the middle of COVID, this is unrealistic. So you need to be flexible about that. But when we get back to normal, this should really be enforced. The policy should address the ownership of equipment and the responsibility for lost, stolen, or damaged equipment. Providing the tools for the employee to do the job. What should the employer provide? Basically, the employer should provide the employee with the same tools the employee is provided with at the workplace. A computer, a printer, a phone, or reimbursement for a phone. Supplies like paper and ink and those sorts of things. Let's talk about reimbursing expenses incurred in this regard. An employee should not be required to pay expenses directly related to working from home. The DOL, Department of Labor, has taken the position that this in fact could constitute a decrease in compensation for the employee, leading to perhaps minimum wage or failure to meet the salary test issues. So DOL has actually said, we will deduct that from what they're paid. And in light of that, an employee may no longer even meet the minimum wage, or in the case of an exempt employee, they may no longer meet the salary threshold test. All responsibilities for providing reasonable accommodations exist with respect to the home workplace. An employee may need, because of a disability, a specific workstation. They may need an ergonomic chair. There may be other issues related to hearing issues or things of that can be addressed through technology. And those are the kinds of things that an employer is still required to consider and supply when an employee is working from home. Set out specifically the responsibility of the employee to care for equipment. It should be the same obligation to care for equipment as if the employee were in the office. Make very clear in the policy that upon the termination of employment, the employee is required to return the equipment to the employer. Now, you want to make sure your policy addresses monitoring work product and deadlines. We all know that in the workplace, an employer has the ability to monitor computers, email, internet usage, that sort of thing. That should apply to work at home, and that should be set forth in your policy. A very clear statement that there is no expectation of privacy should be included. You should also have policies regarding deadlines and communication. How often do you expect an employee to check their email, their phone, that sort of thing? One question that arises is the obligation to attend on-site meetings. Your policy should address this. State clearly whether an employee will be required to attend in-person office meetings. DOL has said that paying wages for travel to the office to attend an in-person meeting for someone who normally works at home is not compensable time, so they don't have to be paid for that. You should have a policy regarding returning employees back to the office in the event that you decide someone should no longer work at home. Policy, as Megan has previously indicated, should retain full discretion in the employer to require the employee to return to work in the office. You might want to note specific issues which might lead to this result, such as a lack of productivity, a lack of accountability, or a lack of communication. Remember that employment laws stay the same, so the applicability of your anti-harassment and discrimination policies is clearly attendant to work from home, and your policy should state that. Specific emphasis should be placed on ensuring that communications, including telephonic communications, email, Zoom, etc., are covered, as this is where it is most likely you may see an issue. Note that your employees are still obligated to follow any business rules and codes of conduct which you have in place. And as Megan talked about at length, wage and hour issues will apply. You want that in your policies, specifically policy statements regarding meals and rest breaks for non-exempt employees. Megan?
You're also going to want to include in your policy information on professionalism, keeping in mind that employees are still representing your company even when they're working remotely. So you're going to want your employees to be more like dog number 2 and not like dog number 1 during Zoom meetings. Another issue you're going to want to consider when managing your workforce is, or your remote workforce, is whether you want to have a telecommuting contract. Again, this is just another opportunity to set those clear expectations for remote workers and have them agree by their signatures that they are in fact going to abide by those expectations. If you have a telecommuting policy, the contract should reference that policy and state explicitly that employee agrees to comply with the policy, and that, as well as your other employment policies that are still in effect. They will need to acknowledge that, and if they do not, they're acknowledging that they may be subject to discipline, including losing the right to telecommute. Often these contracts note that the employee has been approved based on certain criteria, and if there's a duration, they'll include that. It may also state that the employee, should the employee later fail to meet the criteria, like if they're later put on a work improvement plan, they may lose the privilege to telecommute. In any event, the contract should remind employees that the ability to work remotely is left to the discretion of the employer and is not an entitlement, again with the caveat for reasonable accommodations. As I discussed a few minutes ago, you're going to want to lay out maybe the hours of work that's important to include in the contract. They're agreeing to be available between the hours of 9 and 5, or they're agreeing that they will create their own schedule, but that they're agreeing also that they're going to be working 8 hours a day. We're also going to hit wage and hour. They're agreeing to report all-time work, and that if they need overtime, they're going to request that in advance, whatever it may be. Your telecommuting contract should also include your standard employment at will statement. Basically, they can still be terminated anytime for any reason. The key here is that employees and courts, if it ever came to it, understand that the telecommuting contract is not a guarantee of continued employment. It's just allowing the privilege to work from home. Again, these are just a few examples of what you might want to include in a telecommuting contract, but it's going to vary based on the needs of your business. Now, Clay is going to talk a little bit about potential legal issues.
Working from home presents legal issues, some of which are inherent in any work environment and some of which are unique to working from home. The first of these we want to highlight is possible discrimination issues. There are two key areas where discrimination issues may arise. The first is in choosing who gets to telecommute. And the second is discrimination occurring in the virtual workplace or the work at home station. A remote work policy cannot treat employees differently on the basis of any protected characteristics such as age, disability, perceived disability status, or national origin, or any of the others. Federal, state, and local laws against discrimination in employment remain in full effect, so employers should not, for instance, ask only those over a certain age or those who are perceived to have a disability or those who are from certain countries to work from home. Decisions made regarding who gets to work from home must be free from any bias of that nature. And all anti-discrimination laws apply to the work from home environment. It's important to emphasize this. Where I see the problem particularly arising is in that electronic communication, whether it's email, text, Zoom meetings, that sort of thing, and people making comments that carry with them some kind of discriminatory animus. So you are going to want to, as I said, in your policy, make sure that you have a statement saying they can't do that. But then when they do that, you take immediate action to ensure that you have dealt with it, if necessary, discipline, but you need to stay on top of that. We've talked at length about wage and hour issues, but that is obviously a legal issue which arises in the work from home arena. One interesting trend that has been reported is the tendency of employers to want to treat employees who work from home as independent contractors. They're not independent contractors, they're employees. The fact that they're doing the work from another location doesn't change the fact that they are employees. Now, where the work is performed is in fact one factor in determining whether someone is an independent contractor or an employee. But in this instance, because it is the employer and employee agreeing where the work is going to be performed, that doesn't change the employment status. Reasonable accommodation, I spoke a little bit about this earlier. You're going to want to make sure that you're reasonably accommodating employees who need those. You're going to want to perhaps have a new process for allowing employees to request a reasonable accommodation in the work from home environment. We got an interesting question, I love this, where someone asked, is coming into the office an accommodation possibly, such as for someone who is suffering because they feel so isolated. They have a mental health issue because they're feeling isolated working at home, and they're requesting a reasonable accommodation of actually coming into the office. Absolutely, that could be a reasonable accommodation. During this time of COVID, that would not be a reasonable accommodation because of the potential for undue hardship to the employer or direct threat because of the disease. But in general, yes, that could be a reasonable accommodation. It is important to remember that workers' compensation laws still apply when there is the work from home arrangement. The issue here, which is very interesting, is whether the injury is work-related. Okay, as we talked about before, clarity on what the hours of work actually are can help in this regard. So if it's set forth in the policy, set forth in the contract that the hours the employee is to work are from 8 to 5, and the injury occurs at midnight, then the employer probably has a good argument that that injury is not work-related. It's possible, but it's a good argument. Interestingly, OSHA has provided guidance on situations which may or may not be work-related injuries. For example, if an employee drops a box of work documents and injures his or her foot, that's going to be considered work-related. If an employee's fingernail is punctured by a needle from a sewing machine, when the sewing machine is used to perform garment work at home for the employer, that is going to be considered a work-related injury. If an employee, and this is one that OSHA actually said, and I think this is really good guidance here. If an employee is injured because he or she trips on the family dog while rushing to answer a work phone call, that will not be work-related. And finally, if an employee is working at home and is electrocuted because of faulty home wiring, that injury is not going to be considered work-related. Megan, you want to talk about some practical considerations now?
So as you may have recently experienced or be currently experiencing, managing a remote workforce can definitely be challenging. One of the most important tips that we can provide is just to simply have a plan in place for how you're going to be monitoring and how you're going to be evaluating employees. Also have a plan in place for clear communication. I think one of the biggest issues we see in any employment issue is just a breakdown in communication. So setting that communication expectations and just general performance expectations clearly for the employees ahead of time will go a long way. This may include some training for supervisors on how to manage a remote workforce, maybe more frequent check-ins with employees, a more structured workflow system so you make sure that employees have enough to do but aren't overloaded, have collaboration tools available like Zoom, and anticipating that these employees are probably struggling with some things while working from home, especially right now when they're balancing family, childcare obligations, as well as dealing with a loss of community. There's a lot of studies out there right now that our communities are going through mass grief right now as we're trying to process everything that's happening. Your employees are the same. You may also need to work with employees to establish a set structure for the day, including a start time and an end time and the legally mandated breaks, to ensure that employees are doing an okay job, not blurring the lines too much between family and professionalism. We're also going to want to encourage and monitor employee engagement, offering support for mental stress, whether it's COVID related or not, including maybe an employee assistance program, ensuring community through virtual tools like a Zoom happy hour. In the picture, that's a Zoom happy hour with a bunch of dogs, which I think would bring employees lots of happiness. And then be available to answer questions and seek input. You can also work on being empathetic and flexible with employees. As we work through this process, we're all learning how to work remotely right now. Nothing's perfect, and it's going to be a little bit of trial and error right now. So now Clay is going to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Megan. I first want to note in connection with this that one of the attorneys at our office has established what she calls her coffee break group that meets weekly, that simply allows people to check in and talk about how they're doing with working from home because of COVID. And it is reported that that is very well received. I've participated in a couple of the meetings, and I find it extremely helpful and good to just maintain that sense of community. So I would strongly encourage you to perhaps try to set up something like that, or encourage employees to take the initiative to set that up. It looks like we have a question here. Nope, no questions. Well, in that event, we are going to sign off. We want to thank you all so much for participating today. Again, we welcome any feedback that you can give us. We always want to improve these webinars and in any way we can. And we really do want you to know what else you want to hear about. We want to be a resource for you. We want to be responsive to what you need and want. So please don't hesitate to let us know.
Clay, it actually looks like we got a question. Do you want to take that?
The question is regarding dependent care. How would you ask employees to, excuse me, certify that dependent care would not interfere with their work? You get them to sign a contract, first of all, which Megan had talked about, which would say, I agree that I will not permit dependent care issues to interfere with my work. So you have that. But in terms of determining whether it is interfering with what they're doing, I think that what you can do is simply look at the productivity and efficiency, responsiveness, attentiveness to work things. And if you are noticing that an employee is not being as productive or responsive, then address that issue with the employee as you would any other performance-related issue. And if it comes out in that this is because they're having dependent care issues, you want to explore what those are. Again, during this time of COVID, we want to have flexibility. This is crazy for every parent who's got kids at home, and we just need to be flexible in the workplace. But once we get past this and kids are back in school, back in daycare, back in summer programs, then you're going to want to be enforcing a little more strictly. Any other questions?
I don't think so.
I don't see any. Well, again, thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.